Hi, my name is Andrea Sander, and I am a master's candidate at Concordia University in Canada. Welcome to my poster. The idea behind this project came from a question parents raising a bilingual child ask very frequently. How can I make sure my baby is learning both languages at the same time? And is there a strategy to make this happen? These are very relevant questions because around the world, more and more children are growing up bilingually. In fact, in Canada's major cities, 25% of children are growing up in bilingual homes. I invite you to review this interactive map, based on census data by Schott, Kremen, and Byers-Heinlein to learn more about it. We were interested in learning about linguistic environments because different families might use different language configurations. For example, in a family, both parents might decide to speak both languages to the child, whereas in other families, they might decide that each parent should stick to one language. Actually, that configuration is known as the one parent, one language, and it is the most well-known and the most represented in the literature, but it might not be the most common in our sample of bilingual families. It was also important to us to learn about language configurations because they affect the balance to which the baby is exposed to both languages, and balance in turn may affect learning outcomes. So, in order to learn about language configurations in our sample and how they affect balance, we interviewed 151 families who were raising babies between the ages of 8 and 19 months. The participants were learning English and French and were less than 10% exposed to a third language, and they were all from Montreal, Canada. Parents were asked to fill a language exposure questionnaire under the MAPLE approach, and they were asked if they used English and French when speaking to their child regularly, sometimes, or never. Based on their responses, we identified 4 language exposure configurations. So, both parents bilingual, meaning both parents spoke both languages regularly. One parent bilingual, in which one parent spoke both languages regularly and the other parent just one language. And also the well-known one parent, one language configurations, both in a more flexible sense in which each parent spoke mainly one language but would sometimes speak the other, and in a more strict sense. Based on the parental responses, we also identified the baby's overall exposure, meaning that we investigated the balance of exposure, and babies could be hearing both languages nearly equally, meaning a pretty balanced exposure, one language somewhat more than the other, or mostly one language, meaning a pretty unbalanced exposure. What we found it was that in our sample, the most common language configurations were those where both parents were bilingual, which accounts for roughly 50% of our sample, and one parent was bilingual, whereas one parent, one language configurations were not as common, and similar proportions occurred across all ages. As for balance, we found that one parent, one language configurations were more likely associated with a balanced exposure, meaning the babies were hearing both languages nearly equally. But importantly, this balance was attainable with any of the configurations. So, as a recap, in our sample, the most common language configurations were those where one or both parents were bilingual, not the one parent, one language configurations. And this actually goes in line with previous findings. Also, it was important to find that balance was possible under any configurations, meaning it was not exclusively associated with a particular configuration. But it was more likely to happen when there was a one parent, one language configuration. But this does not mean that the one parent, one language configurations are a magic recipe to attain balance in the exposure. And other factors like quality of the input and time spent with each caregiver might also contribute to balance. I would like to take a moment to thank our contributors and my co-authors. Please contact us in our social media. We would love to follow up the discussion and to answer any questions that you have. Thank you very much for keeping with me until the end of the poster.